To be completely honest with everyone who's watching this video, when it comes to the third dimension in Sonic games, I'm about as inexperienced as you can get. Ever since I really became a Sonic fan, I've continuously played the classic games but never paid much attention to the modern games. I've still played every mainline Sonic game, however, the only 3D Sonic game I have finished is Sonic Frontiers, and the only other one is Sonic Adventure, which I haven't finished but have extensively played.
So, when Sonic X Shadow Generations was announced, I was really skeptical and honestly not willing to get the game at all. But at the time, I was still getting used to being a Sonic tuber and realized that I need to jump onto the Sonic X Shadow Generation train while it was still active. And also, it would be the first Sonic game I would meet at its launch. And to be completely honest, I don't think there was a better game for me to play than Shadow Generations after Frontiers. And I'm just gonna say it here, Shadow Generations is one of the best games I have ever played, both in terms of looking at the game prospectively and in terms of enjoyment. For any people who think Shadow Generations isn't nearly as good as I'm making it out to be, allow me to explain myself, and at the end of the video, you'll at least be able to understand why I think Shadow Generations is one of the best Sonic games ever. The controls that are present for Shadow are hands down the best control I've felt for any Boost game character. I wouldn't say it reaches the absolute precision that Sonic Frontiers has with Sonic, but to be completely honest, that's probably more of a good thing, because I couldn't imagine playing this game and just instantly stopping as soon as I stopped moving. But in exchange for better turning control, Shadow just feels so much more slippery in a way that I just can't adapt to. What I mean by this is that the way you boost forward and how you stop just don't go all too well together. When you boost, you start moving immediately, which is exactly what one would expect, but when you're actually trying to stop because of an upcoming ledge or to make a more precise platform jump, it takes way too long for Shadow to take a complete halt. Again, I'm not saying Shadow should stop dead in his tracks the second you stop holding, but the time it takes should be more reduced, so that way reaction time can still have a play in the game without making it feel like there's nothing you could have done to save yourself in any situation. But on the complete flip side, this game offers some really cool customization on your controls, including one where you can change the controls if you're used to Frontiers, which again, makes this game the best jump from Frontiers I could have possibly made. And other than Shadow being a bit slippery for my liking, the only other issue I run into is the turning, which should be expected from any Boost game, but at least here it's better than any other Boost game and it's manageable. But the real question is, what exactly is Shadow interacting with? What's around him? In other words, how's the level design like in the game? Well, the gameplay in Shadow Generations comes down to three main components, one while in white space, one in the Act 1s of zones, and one in the Act 2s of zones. Let's start off with the white space area, which has been completely revamped from Sonic Generations. The original game had a 2D area, with the missions being located at the top of the levels. Nothing all too special, especially considering that just a few games ago we got a full 3D hub world with secrets and the like, but it really wasn't a huge deal. In Shadow Generations, however, white space is completely 3D, with heavy inspiration from the open zone Sonic Frontiers had. While it's not nearly as open-ended as a whole island, in contrast, there are so many more things to do within white space. It's inside white space where we get our Doom powers, and in order to traverse white space properly, you need to master them. With collectibles in order to access some artworks and other pieces, and ring challenges that can be done, the open world's gameplay is something I love a lot. I'm not the type of person to have much incentive to play for side progression a whole lot, but at least the collectibles are a lot more entertaining than, say, all 180 memory tokens from Moreno's Island. Love the gameplay and extra stuff to do, and nothing is all too wrong with it. Secondly, Act 1 parts in the normal zones, and this is the best gameplay Shadow Generations has to offer. Not to say that the other gameplay styles the game displays are bad at all, but the 3D sections are the highlight of gameplay. They actually remind me of another 3D Sonic fan game I've played called Sonic World. Obviously, the level of quality isn't near this game's level, but it was quite easy to get used to, with the minor exception of skating platforming, which doesn't bode all too well with the controls of the game. And the third and final aspect of Shadow Generations gameplay, and by far the worst, is the second act, which are all in 2D. Sure, I would prefer the way they went about it here as opposed to Sonic Generations, where about 80% of the game is in 2D, but the 2D segments in Shadow Generations feel just about as bad as Cyberspace, control-wise and gameplay-wise. Sure, the reduced speed makes platforming a lot more manageable, but it feels so underwhelming, and gameplay just generally becomes way more dull and unenjoyable in these sections. To its credit, it isn't bad, not by any means of the word, but it certainly isn't something good either. Moving on from the main aspect that I personally look for in a Sonic game, we move on to visuals. What does the game look like in terms of quality, shading, lighting, and the like? Well, I can confidently say that without any doubt that Shadow Generations is by far the best Sonic game ever. bar none. And really, it isn't even close. Now, I do have my nitpicks, like Maria looking like a Pixar character and not fitting properly when right next to Shadow, but the visuals the game has are perfect otherwise. Along with that, the presentation in this game is absolutely amazing. Not only does the game feel and look a lot more smoother than any other Sonic game so far, the game runs at 120 FPS and the cinematics are so good. To be completely honest, the story or even just the cutscenes were never something I really found all that important. But Shadow Generations makes me want to watch them. I mean, the obvious highlight in the game has to be the ending of the 4 boss fights and the appearance of Doom in the middle of the acts, but everything else is also very good. So overall, what I'm trying to say is that in terms of visuals and presentation, cutscenes and cinematics, Shadow Generations is absolutely perfect, being the best Sonic game yet. But of course, Shadow Generations would be pretty boring if it didn't have any gimmick that made it different from Sonic Generations, or even just boost games as a whole. The Doom powers make this a reality, which are collected as the story progresses and have a range of abilities, from transport to attack. The first Doom power we see is a pair of wings that Shadow obtains in Act 2 of the Space Colony arc. These aren't the full version of the ability though, and it allows Shadow to glide in the air and depletes your boost gauge. Honestly, a pretty cool ability, especially since in Act 2, the 2D makes it so you won't be slipping as much as you do with the full ability later on in the game. After this act, however, we don't see this version of the power again. Afterwards, we have the Doom Spears, which are pretty standard. It's just Shadow's Chaos Spear but infused with Black Doom energy. It can be used to stun certain enemies that would otherwise hurt you if you hit it, like certain enemies in Real Canyon and the Cyclone enemy from Chaos Island. It's a very nifty ability that allows for higher roots if you have quick timing, and it can be used for combat too, so it's a good ability as well. Next up, we have the Doom Surf. And this is where I start to have the problem with the Doom powers. Until now, none of the Doom powers have really changed the main controls of Shadow all that much, and the Doom Surf exists as a way to cross bodies of water easier. The problem I have with it is in terms of controls, I've never felt more slippery. Turning with the Doom Surf takes you into an extremely wide arc of sorts. Stopping is nigh impossible, and turning around or trying to turn back is even harder. But on the flip side, it is the coolest Doom power design wise, and if you're trying to do some missions, this overall isn't a bad Doom power. The fourth Doom power Shadow gets is the Doom Morph, which is by far my least favorite Doom power of all because of many aspects of it. The design doesn't look the best, the controls could not be more annoying to get used to, the boost is lackluster, and its speed is something to cry about. You know it's really bad when using the ability in the area you're meant to use it in is slower than just not using the ability and jumping and boosting. Overall, by far the worst Doom power because of bad controls and difficulty getting used to it. And finally, the last Doom power is a sort of super form within Shadow Generations. It uses your boost gauge and your rings depletes and you can fly for a long amount of time. Now, you can't fly indefinitely, I learned that the hard way during Radical Highway Act 2, but it is extremely fun to mess around with, especially with the earlier levels in the game. I think it is a little stupid that it takes both your rings and your boost gauge, but I digress. Next up, we have the boss fights seen in the game. I think these boss fights work a lot more in favor of nostalgic value than actual gameplay, because when comparing these to an average boss in any other Sonic game, it doesn't really compare. Sure, the boss fights aren't bad by any means of the word, but their gameplay can be a bit repetitive at times, especially the first one. We start off with the Bio Lizard, probably the most offensive of the repetitiveness than any other boss. Sure, it is the first boss and it's meant to be a bit on the easier side, but the waiting time and mashing the square button take way too much time from the main boss. Secondly, we have the Neo Metal Sonic boss, and it's one of the visually better bosses, but the gameplay is just using Doom Surf to knock things into it. I do think it was extremely cool of Sonic Team to purposely have you use Chaos Control, only for it to just not work because of the whole copy data thing that Metal Sonic did in Heroes, and the setting is honestly pretty cool. I just wish things would change up a bit more like it did towards the end of the fight. Third, we have the Mephiles fight, something I had really high hopes for, and it's actually a lot more diverse than the previous two bosses, and having a lot more different things to do like dodging his attacks and using the Doom Morph in a non-confusing way. Plus the ending is such a cool nod to Sonic 06. And lastly, we have the Devil Doom and Neo Devil Doom boss, and really, it's just a merging of every boss, excluding the Biolizard with some platforming in between, with the Doom Wings being used as well. As I have said, the Doom Wings are kind of junky when moving in 3D, and Doomorph is also being used here too with disappearing platforms, but all in all, I don't think the final boss is bad in any way. And lastly, we have, in my opinion, the least important aspect of any Sonic game. I never even watched any of the Frontier story because gameplay and what it encompasses are what I think should take heavy priority. I'm not trying to start the whole story as insignificant argument, but what I am saying is that a good game with the worst story ever, in my eyes, is probably still a good game. But Shadow Generations, in terms of story, actually had me listening to it. The whole concept of Maria and Dr. Gerald being there throughout the story was absolutely amazing, and the ending is probably my favorite Sonic ending yet, with Shadow stopping himself from saving Maria and Dr. Gerald and Rouge and the whole tear pit. Wow. Sure, to be completely honest, the whole white space timeline thing kinda takes a back seat, and the levels are really just a place for the whole thing with Doom to happen, but the whole thing flows so nicely, and Shadow just frantically thinking of a way to save Maria fits his character so well. And speaking of the story, we should also talk about the dialogue. Now look, I know this is a Shadow Generations only review, but I just need to point out how awful the Sonic Generation Remake's dialogue is. There is absolutely none of the actual good parts of Generations, like the interaction between characters in white space, Amy's and Knuckles at the end of the game, Sonic and Amy at the start, and don't even get me started with the shoehorned in references like South Island. We're gonna be acting like Sonic hasn't gone through time without the Time Stones? Heck, in that very game, he just ran really fast and went through time without them. And even the most minute details of the dialogue, like the font they used, piss me off to no end. But in the case of Shadow Generations, the characterization of characters and the way they talk to each other doesn't have any issues. Now there are some iffy sections. The whole bit with Maria before Shadow leaves for the Rise to Radical Highway could not be more cringy, and after the fight with Sonic, Rouge saying,
"As a professional jewel thief, I approve,"
could not have been a better representation of the 2024 YouTube comments. I still think that for the most part, the story in Shadow Generation is one I wouldn't mind rewatching and is one of the better ones. And that's my general opinion on Shadow Generations. Firstly, I do want to say that I apologize in advance because I already know this video isn't going to be nearly as good as my Sonic CD video, simply because of the fact that 3D reviewing is a lot more different than 2D, and I wasn't really used to it when I was making this video. Secondly, I do want to say that between now and January the 2nd, there will be only one upload for this one. Yeah, so after this one, I'll think of a video idea and I'll make it. Then after that will be the January 2nd thing I'm planning, because January 2nd is going to be the 1 year anniversary for the channel. It's going to be 1 year since I started, so I plan on making something special for that. So yeah, that's it. If you enjoyed it, however, you can check out my full playlist of Sonic reviews that I have in the description down below. Leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a good day and night wherever you are.